It was a Tuesday evening, and everything seemed unusually peaceful. The kind of quiet night that lulls you into a deep sense of security when the world outside feels calm and at rest. I was exhausted from the work week, more tired than I had been in a while, and I longed for nothing more than a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. My son Luke had been my everything for the past 8 years since my divorce from Alex. The split wasn't a bad one, just a quiet drift between us over time, but raising Luke on my own had been both a joy and a challenge. He was everything to me, smart, funny, and always kind. Yet there were times when the weight of being both mother and father to him wore me down. That night, the exhaustion hit me hard. I hardly had the energy to change into my pajamas before I crawled into bed, pulling the covers around me. The house was still. Luke had gone to bed hours ago after a long evening of video games and homework. I finally had a moment of quiet, and I welcomed it. As I sank into the warmth of my bed, the soft glow of moonlight filtered through the curtains. My body was so tired, my mind so worn out, that I felt as if sleep was right at my fingertips. I closed my eyes, thinking about how peaceful everything had been lately. Life had slowed down after the chaos of the last year. Luke and I had been through a lot together. After Alex left, it had just been the two of us, figuring out life on our own. Although Luke was almost 20 now, we still shared a close bond. He had grown up so much, yet in many ways, he still needed me, and I still needed him. I drifted off for a moment, but a soft knock on my bedroom door pulled me out of my thoughts. Groggy and half-dreaming, I barely registered the sound until it came again. Gentle but persistent. "Mom?" Luke's voice, barely above a whisper, reached me, enough to fully wake me. I blinked, trying to focus. The hallway light outside the door cast a dim silhouette of Luke standing in the doorway. I propped myself up on my elbows, still half-dazed. "Luke, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, closing the door behind him quietly. There was something in the way he moved, uncertain and tentative, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be there. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly, avoiding my gaze. A pang of concern hit me. Luke had been having trouble sleeping lately. I suspected it was because of the changes in our lives since his father left, though he never openly spoke about it. The absence of Alex had hit him harder than he let on. I patted the bed beside me. "Come here. You can stay with me tonight if you want." Luke hesitated again, but then he climbed into bed beside me, curling up on his side. He was close enough that I could feel his warmth, but there was a strange, almost uncomfortable distance in the way he settled in. I could sense that something was different, though I wasn't sure exactly what it was. I brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, my heart softening. It had been a while since Luke had sought comfort like this. He'd grown up so fast, and I couldn't remember the last time he'd wanted to be so close. "Is everything okay?" I asked quietly, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. He didn't respond at first, but his breathing slowed, and I thought he might be drifting off. Then, in the quiet of the room, he spoke again. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" His voice was barely audible, and I knew exactly who he was talking about. I hesitated, then nodded softly. "I do sometimes, Luke. But things weren't good between us. It wasn't your fault." Luke didn't answer right away. He seemed to be lost in his thoughts. I could feel the weight of everything he was carrying, but I didn't push him. I knew that sometimes it was better to let him share when he was ready. We lay there in silence for a while, and though I knew he was still awake, there was a comfort in just being near him. The silence in the room was thick, the only sound coming from the gentle rustle of the sheets as Luke shifted beside me. I could tell he wasn't sleeping, but he hadn't spoken for a while either. The room felt still, almost suspended in time, as if the night was giving us both a moment to think. After a while, Luke stirred again, breaking the quiet. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with uncertainty. I didn't need to ask who he meant. I knew he was talking about his father. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking of the years before everything fell apart, the life we had when we were a family, the dream that never quite lived up to its promise. "Maybe," I said softly. "But we can't change the past, Luke. We can only move forward." Luke let out a small sigh, and I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. I could tell that the absence of his father was something he still carried with him, something he hadn't fully let go of. He was still so young in many ways, despite being almost 20. The emotional toll of his father's departure had left deeper scars than I realized. "I just wonder if I could have done something different," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Maybe if I had been better, or maybe if I had tried harder, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." His words hit me hard, and for a moment, I felt my breath catch in my chest. I turned to face him fully, sitting up and taking his hand in mine. His eyes avoided mine, but I could see the pain there, pain that had been buried for too long. "Luke," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "you didn't do anything wrong. You were a kid. None of this is your fault." He looked at me then, his dark eyes filled with sadness, but there was a flicker of something else there too, something vulnerable. He shook his head slowly, as if not believing me. "But if I had been better, if I hadn't been so difficult, maybe he would have stayed," Luke said, his voice breaking. Tears welled in my eyes as I leaned forward, pulling him into a tight hug. For a moment he stiffened, but then he let himself relax into my embrace. I felt his body tremble against mine, and I held him closer, trying to convey everything I couldn't put into words. "Listen to me, Luke," I whispered, my voice soft but firm. "Your dad's leaving had nothing to do with you. He made his own choices, and those choices were his. You were always more than enough. You are enough." He buried his face into my shoulder, and I felt his body relax a little. The tension that had been there seemed to ease, but I could still feel the lingering weight of everything he had been holding inside. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other in the quiet of the night. It was a familiar comfort, but also a reminder of how much we had both been through. After some time, I felt Luke's breathing slow, and I realized he had fallen asleep in my arms. I didn't want to disturb him, so I stayed still, just listening to the sound of his steady breaths. In the dark, as I lay there with my son, I felt a warmth spread through me. It wasn't just the warmth of a mother comforting her child. It was something deeper, something more intense. And though I wasn't sure what it meant, it felt like a shift. Something had changed between us, even if I couldn't fully understand it. I gently brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, trying to focus on the steady rhythm of his breathing. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, something unspoken hanging in the air between us. I couldn't help but wonder what this new shift in our relationship meant and where it might lead. But for now, I didn't have to answer those questions. Tonight, I had my son here with me, and that was enough. The next morning came too soon. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams of light across the room. I woke up earlier than usual, feeling the familiar warmth of Luke's presence beside me. He was still asleep, his face peaceful, free from the tension that had weighed him down the night before. For a moment, I just watched him, my heart swelling with the familiar, comforting love I always felt for him. He looked so much like a boy in that moment, despite all the years that had passed and how much he'd grown. He was almost 20 now, but to me, he was still my little boy. I slipped out of bed quietly, trying not to wake him. As I moved through the house preparing breakfast, I couldn't shake the thoughts of last night. Luke had opened up to me in a way I hadn't expected, and it was clear that the guilt he felt over his father's departure had been weighing on him for a long time. He had never really talked about it before, but last night, I saw how deeply it affected him. And yet, it wasn't just that. There was something else, something different that had shifted between us. I busied myself with the pancakes, trying to keep my mind occupied. But every now and then, I found my thoughts drifting back to the conversation we had shared. The way he looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes. It had all felt so familiar, but also so different. When Luke finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes and looking like he had just woken up, I smiled, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, placing a plate of pancakes on the table. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, sitting down and beginning to dig into his breakfast. He seemed more like himself today, his usual quiet but relaxed demeanor returning. I was relieved to see him in better spirits, but a part of me couldn't ignore the subtle shift I felt between us. We ate in silence for a while, the sunlight streaming through the windows and filling the kitchen with warmth. It felt normal, peaceful even. But I couldn't help but notice the way Luke would glance at me every now and then, his gaze lingering just a bit longer than usual. I didn't say anything, though. I wasn't ready to bring up last night. Finally, Luke broke the silence. "Thanks for last night, Mom," he said, his voice soft, and I could hear a level of vulnerability in it that I hadn't heard in a long time. I needed that. I looked up, surprised by his honesty. "You don't have to thank me, Luke. I'm always here for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his eyes were searching mine, waiting for more. I wasn't sure what he wanted to hear, so I just smiled gently, offering him the reassurance he needed without pushing him to explain further. I could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. It wasn't just the conversation from last night, it was something more. There was a subtle change in the air, something neither of us had addressed yet, but I knew we both felt it. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked quietly, his voice still carrying that undertone of vulnerability. I sighed softly, my heart heavy with the memories of the past. "Maybe, but we can't change what happened, Luke. We can only move forward." He looked down at his plate, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the napkin. "I guess I just wonder if I could have done something differently. If maybe I had been better. Maybe that would have kept Dad here." His words were like a punch to the gut. I felt the air in the room grow thick, and I sat up straighter, focusing on him fully. "Luke, no," I said firmly, my voice trembling slightly. "You did nothing wrong. None of this was your fault. Your dad made his own choices. You've always been more than enough." Luke's eyes were filled with a quiet sadness, but I could see a flicker of relief, as though he was hearing something he desperately needed to hear. He nodded but didn't speak, his gaze still lowered. I could feel the weight of the unspoken emotions between us, but there was something more there, something that neither of us was willing to put into words yet. For a moment, I wanted to reach out to him again, to pull him into another hug and reassure him that everything would. But instead, I sat still, allowing the silence to speak for us. I could feel the tension between us, but it was different this time. It was a tension I didn't want to ignore, even though it was uncomfortable. We finished breakfast without saying much more, and Luke went upstairs to work on his homework. I stayed in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts. The truth was, I had felt something change between us last night, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. It wasn't just about comforting him anymore. There was something deeper there, something that both scared and comforted me at the same time. The days that followed felt different. It wasn't that anything had explicitly changed in our routine, but there was a quiet shift between Luke and me. It was subtle, almost like the air around us had thickened in a way that made everything feel more charged, more intimate. It wasn't in the things we said, but in the little things we didn't say. I caught Luke glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. There was a tenderness in his gaze, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the look of a son seeking comfort from his mother. It was something more. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my heart race every time our eyes met, even for just a moment. That evening, we were cleaning up after dinner, like we always did. Luke was drying the dishes while I washed them, the sound of water running and the steady rhythm of our work filling the kitchen with a kind of calm. The evening sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm golden glow over everything. It felt like a peaceful, ordinary night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I handed Luke a plate and our fingers brushed. The simple touch sent a spark of warmth through me, and I quickly pulled my hand away, trying not to let the moment linger. But Luke didn't pull back. He just held the plate for a moment longer, his hand lingering over mine in a way that felt more deliberate than it should have. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes were focused on me, but there was something deeper there, something that made my heart beat faster. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just a moment, but I knew I couldn't. The connection between us felt different now, and it terrified me. "Are you okay, Mom?" Luke asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking about things." He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he set the dish down on the counter and turned to face me fully. His eyes were searching mine, as if he wanted to ask something but wasn't sure how. I felt the tension between us grow, thick and palpable, and I didn't know how to navigate it. Everything about the way he was looking at me felt different, more intimate in a way that made me feel both drawn to him and afraid. It was as though the boundary between mother and son was starting to blur, and I didn't know how to stop it. Luke stepped closer, closing the gap between us until he was just inches away. For a moment, we just stood there, the quiet of the kitchen wrapping around us like a cocoon. Then, without saying a word, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. The simple gesture sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't breathe. His fingers lingered on my skin for just a second too long, and I felt my pulse quicken. He looked at me, his gaze steady and full of something I couldn't name, but that made my heart race. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You know, things have changed, Mom," he said softly. "I think we both feel it." My heart skipped a beat. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged it aloud. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever was happening between us, but I couldn't deny that it was real. "I know," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "I think I feel it too." Luke reached out again, his hand brushing mine, and this time I didn't pull away. Our fingers brushed together, and for a moment I felt a wave of warmth rush through me. Something deeper than what I'd ever felt before. It was like we were holding on to something fragile, something new, and I was afraid that if I acknowledged it too fully, it would break. I could feel the weight of the change between us, but there was no going back now. I didn't know what was happening, or why it was happening, but I couldn't deny that something had shifted in the air between us. Luke squeezed my hand gently, his thumb brushing over my skin in a way that sent a wave of warmth through me. We stood there in silence, neither of us knowing what to do with the emotions that were swirling between us. Finally, Luke broke the silence. "I don't know what this is, but He paused, his words hanging in the air. "I just want to be close to you, Mom." My heart skipped again. His words were so simple, but they carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just smiled softly, trying to push away the fear and confusion that were creeping in. "It's okay, Luke," I said quietly. "We'll figure this out." But as the evening passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us were no longer the same. Whatever had begun that night in my room, whatever had started when he had come to me for comfort, it was growing, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. As the days passed, the quiet intimacy between Luke and me grew more undeniable. It was subtle, but it was there, like an invisible thread tying us together in ways I hadn't expected. Our routine stayed the same: breakfast together, quiet evenings at home, but the air between us felt different. Each glance, each touch felt loaded with something unspoken. It was hard to ignore. At times, I found myself questioning it, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was just overthinking the way Luke looked at me, the way his touch lingered a second longer than it should. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something had changed, and it wasn't just about the comforting moments we'd shared or the conversations we'd had. It was deeper, and it felt like it was shifting in ways I couldn't control. That evening, after dinner, Luke and I found ourselves on the couch again, sitting side by side, the dim light of the TV flickering across the room. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt right. We were content just being together, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't ignore. Luke shifted closer to me, and I felt his arm brush against mine. My heart skipped, and I tried to focus on the movie, but it was impossible. Every movement felt charged. I could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle way his presence seemed to pull me in. I glanced at him, and for the first time, I noticed how much he had changed. He wasn't just my son anymore. There was something else in the way he looked at me, something that made my pulse quicken. His eyes were soft, but there was an intensity behind them that I hadn't seen before. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. Our fingers intertwined, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel the warmth of his hand in mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and it felt as though everything else in the world had faded away. There was no rush, no need to speak. Just the simple act of holding hands was enough. I didn't know what it meant, but in that moment, I realized that things between us had changed in ways I couldn't fully explain. I had always loved Luke with every part of me, but now there was something deeper, something more. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I feel it too, Luke." He looked at me, his gaze steady, searching. "Do you think it's wrong?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of my own emotions. "But it doesn't feel wrong. It feels right." Luke's eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But instead, he just smiled. A small, tender smile that spoke volumes. He squeezed my hand as if to reassure me that we were in this together, whatever this was. The movie ended, but we didn't move. We just sat there, holding hands, letting the moment wash over us. It felt like we had crossed a line, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt content. It was as though this had always been meant to happen, and now that it had, everything else faded into the background. After a while, Luke leaned his head against my shoulder, and I couldn't help but let out a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't just the physical closeness, it was the emotional connection that had deepened between us. It wasn't something I could fully explain, but it was real, and I knew deep down that we would face whatever came next together. That night, after we cleaned up, we went outside to the porch, sitting in the cool evening air. The stars were clear in the sky, and the quietness of the night felt comforting, like the world had slowed down just for us. Luke reached over and took my hand again, his fingers warm against mine. We didn't need to talk. There was a peace in our silence, an understanding that neither of us had to verbalize. Whatever had happened between us, whatever was growing, it didn't need to be explained. It was simply there, and it felt real. As we sat there, I realized that I wasn't sure where this path would lead us, but I knew one thing for certain. Luke wasn't just my son anymore. He had become something more, something I couldn't quite name, but something that filled my heart with a warmth I had never known before. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, with Luke's hand in mine, I knew we were stronger than ever. We would face whatever came next together, whatever this new chapter meant for both of us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with it.